Hello and welcome to another interview with a writing professional with Writers on Fire. I'm Nikki Tate, and today I am most honored to be speaking with the poet and visual artist, Dorothy Field, otherwise known as Daughter. Daughter, I can't think of a better way for you to introduce yourself than by sharing one of your marvelous poems with us. So would you be game for that?
I would be happy to. So this poem was recently published in this chapbook, which is a chapbook of 18 poems put out by Frog Hollow Press, all about different artists. And so I am going to read one called Alabado sea Dios o Alabado sea el Señor, which means praise be the Lord, praise be God. And that's the title, but there's another part of the title is Floyd and Georgia in New Mexico. So Georgia is obviously Georgia O'Keeffe. I hoped Floyd Trujillo would sing for me a hymn of the penitentes, lay brothers who retreated to windowless moradas after the priests abandoned them, who flogged themselves out of faith. Hoped he'd sing me those haunting alabados in the minor mode of medieval Jewish music that secret Jews carried when they fled Spain, or tiny barrios behind the hills, hidden Jews turned hidden Catholic renegades. I learned later Floyd was hermano mayor, the elder brother of the Abiquiu Morada, not far from George's adobe home. He didn't sing, but he showed me the elk antlers he carved. I bought a San Francisco de Assis, one antler arm stretched, palm open, a small bird on his shoulder. Bought it because I loved St. Francis and his canticle to brother sun, sister moon. I am a Jew, Floyd told me. I am too, I answered. Floyd used to drive Georgia in his old rattletrap out to the red cliffs and pied hummocks dotted with scraggy junipers, carried her battered box of watercolors, her pastels, and her folding stools, so she could paint herself into those dusky hills, their resinous scent, their forms so like the hips and breasts and clefts her husband loved to photograph. Her husband being Alfred Stieglitz, who was a brilliant photographer. And I'll show you the thing that I bought. This is, let's see if you can see it. Well, it doesn't show up very well, but anyway.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
There it is.
There.
The elk antlers.
Fabulous. Well, there is a lot in that poem and layers and layers. So why don't we tell me a bit about that? How do you come to your subject matter? How on earth did you tackle? Where did that poem come from?
I was visiting a very, very old friend who lives in Santa Fe. And I had gotten very interested in the secret Jews because there were a bunch of Jews who came to Mexico and moved north to New Mexico. And it was at the time of the, what do you call it? But when the Spaniards kicked the Jews out. There's a word for it, but it's gone from my head. It'll come back when I don't need it. Anyway, and so I was reading the Santa Fe newspaper one morning, and there was this article about Floyd Trujillo, who was a musician and a sculptor of bones. And they said he would have visitors. So I called and he said, sure. So Floyd, like many of those who are a mixture of First Nations and some of them Jews, not all of them, but some of them are Jews. And it's very mysterious. And so we went to visit him and spent hours. And it was a total surprise to me when he said he was a Jew. But I have been in contact with the New Mexico state historian who was Jewish and who have been doing a lot of work about these mestizo Jews who live in the pueblos or near the pueblos, and so it was just an amazing day. He was a marvelous man, and it was a great surprise.
So I'm curious about your process, and we can dig into this a little bit more later. So you have this experience in the desert, and so combination of art, history, personal story, and personal connection.
Yep.
At what point does a poem begin to emerge for you?
Gosh. This poem would have been written at least a number of years ago. So how did it I think it was just such an amazing day that I just started to write about it. I think that's what happened. But often a poem happens because a line just comes into my head and I don't know what it's about or where it's going. Or I think when I first started writing poetry, which is a while ago, I used to know where I was going, but now I'm much happier if I don't know where I'm going, because then something arises which surprises me and which is often much more interesting than if I had planned it all out. And actually, that's how I do art these days. Many years ago, I was a weaver and I would start a piece and I would have a picture in my head of exactly what I wanted it to be like. And that was a disaster because it was never as good as it was in my head. Some people have the kind of skill that they can picture something and they go about creating it. But now when I'm making art, I really don't want to know where I'm going. And I'm now doing print-based work, but I never do editions. I often print on loose pieces of paper, and then I kind of move them around and collage them onto handmade paper I made after I stopped weaving. I was making handmade paper. I'm not doing that anymore either, but I am printing. And I'm very, very happy not to know where I'm going.
So this is becoming a real experimenting, playful, free, loose process by the sound of it. And is that true for the poetry as well? And both?
I think it is much more true. Yes, it is. So I start somewhere, but I really don't know where I'm going. And I prefer that. It means that I meet myself in a way I didn't know myself in a way. Whereas I know what I know of myself, I know it can be pretty boring. So it's nice to meet something that isn't what I know.
That's fair enough.
Connected in that way.
Okay. So now I have a question for you. So if you don't have an idea of the end where you're aiming for it, how do you know when a piece is finished? How do you know when a poem is finished?
I have nothing more to say. But I mean, it's also true that, I scribble things down before I start on the computer, and it can be weeks or even months I go back to something and I see, and it goes somewhere else. So I don't assume poems are finished for maybe quite a while.
Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, we sort of jumped ahead there right into your process, but if we could back up a little bit, give me the quick synopsis of who are you? Where are you from? Give me your
I
quick
was
biography.
I was born in New York City. I grew up in the suburbs of New York in a really stupid town, and where having a brain was a terrible deficit. And the teachers mostly didn't have any brains. So anyway, fortunately, I survived that and went to university. And after that, I worked for 1 year in New York as a picture researcher for American Heritage for their dictionary they were making at that time. But New York wasn't good for me. And so I moved to Berkeley, where I had spent some summers and I loved. And then I started weaving. And then I met this guy, and he was planning to move to British Columbia, so I followed him. An independent sort of person I was. It didn't even dawn on me to think, is this a good idea? Anyway, I did that, and we farmed a small 15-acre farm north of Victoria for about 30 years. And then he left, and it took me a while before I thought, wow, was I lucky? And I was lucky. And so I thought I would keep farming, but it was too much for me on my own. So I moved to Victoria, bought an old house with a relatively big piece of ground, and that's where I am. Anyway, so after weaving, I started making paper, and I was making these very, very large sculptures. And then because I had no way to keep them, so I installed them in the woods, and I would photograph them as they would disintegrate, which took a long time because the paper I was making was Japanese and Nepalese style from very long fibered plants. And so it takes a long time for that paper to break down. And at some point I took a printmaking class, and then I've basically been printmaking. And somewhere along the way, I started writing poetry in 1984. It's about the only year I know, because my then husband and 8-year-old daughter and I went off to Asia for 10 months. And while we were trekking in Nepal, I think it was just the piston action of my feet and that rhythm, bung, bung, bung. Poems start coming up, and I had no idea how to write poetry. I'm not sure I still do, but anyway. And so then it was too much. I couldn't keep up with the weaving and paper making and writing. So that's how it's been. Something comes in and something falls away. And
you're still, so at the moment your visual craft is printmaking and still writing poetry?
Yes.
Yes. So those twins at the moment.
Those are things.
Right. Okay.
And now we're getting into gardening season, and every day I count how many erythroniums are blooming. I have pink, white, and yellow on my rock. And erythroniums, for those who don't know, are native lilies, and they're so beautiful.
Oh, yeah. And the garden, I have seen your garden, and it
Yes.
is a work of art in itself. It is, it's beautiful. And
well, thank you.
Yeah, no, I remember it well, and I miss it, actually, not being able to, well, gardening in general and the coast and the island, and your garden is a beautiful, beautiful place. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I love it. And when it dawned on me after I lived on this property for a couple of years, I realized that I had probably had my hands on every square inch of ground, which I never had done on 15 acres.
Right.
I missed some.
Probably not possible on 15 acres to every inch to handle it. But yes, I can see that on your place in Victoria. That would be, probably correct. So tell me, let's circle back to the poetry. So when you are, what in general, if you look at those poems starting back in 1984,
Yep.
what kinds of subject matter do you find you're drawn to? Certain types of subject matter? Does it change? Has it evolved over time? Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, in Nepal, I started writing about where we were trekking. I don't think they were very good poems. I don't even know if I still have them. But in the years on the farm, it was very nature-based and based on the plants, based on the birds, just watching. And at some point, I am Jewish, and at some point, I felt like I had to learn something more about that because I grew up in a very, very assimilated family. And the message we got was, you can't cover it up that you're Jewish because they'll always find out, but you don't have to like it. And for my mother, who had plenty of internalized anti-Semitism, she didn't really like it much. So at some point in BC, where I first lived, there were just about no Jews, and I realized I felt Jewish. And so I had to figure out what that meant, and that meant that anytime I went to Vancouver, I would stop off at this Jewish bookstore and buy about 5 books and just start reading. Never about belief, but fortunately, Jews don't have to believe anything, but very much about culture and some basic orientation. And I would say that, and what we did when I was growing up, we did do Passover every year. And my father, who was much less alienated than my mother, did a very, very brief but good Seder. And he every year read the social justice parts, which are very, very important in Jewish tradition. And so we say, thou shalt not oppress the stranger. When a stranger resides with you, thou shalt not wrong him or her. And so that stuck with me and has really been the core of what it is for me. And so, and I tell you everything about my life. There was a point when I remembered having been sexually abused. And at that point, for the first time, I started getting interested in politics. And it was as if I found a voice, that remembering, because I had forgotten. So remembering meant that I had access to to my own voice in a different way, and to feeling that I had a right to speak. So now, unfortunately, you can't shut me up about politics. And I spend too much time writing to politicians. And yeah, that's the fourth thing I do, is write to politicians.
Letters to the editor. You've got
letters to the editor and to the politicians.
To the politicians, yes.
Yes, yeah. And I inherited a list from a friend who, for various reasons, didn't want to keep it, and so I have a list, and I tell everybody what to do, and I guess sometimes they do it, and sometimes, if they have any sense, they don't.
I was just thinking, how did we get to the letters to a politician? But yes, it all ties together.
It does tie together.
It does tie together in terms of finding your voice, your subject, what it matters is what you write about, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you are coming to these subjects as time changes and your interests change and your introspect, what it is you're looking at in yourself and the world and around you, the kernel of the idea changes, and those become the poems. So when you you touched on it a little bit before, but say you have this nugget of an idea, how do you go about this process of then shaping what matters into a poem, something that holds together on its own? What do you
Well,
do?
what I could tell you is that I am almost the least technical person I know. So when I was a weaver, I was a good weaver, but I never did the technical stuff. And then when I was a paper maker, I never got into the chemistry the way the people who really do that. And as a poet also, I'm a lousy technician, so I don't I just feel my way. And I think the core for me tends to be emotional. It's and so I guess I'm feeling my way to what the emotion is. But as I say, I know various poets who really, really hone poems, who hone form, and when I have a poetry group, and they say, "What are you doing here? What's this about?" And I say, "Oh gosh, I hadn't even thought about that." So then I have to think about it. But it isn't my approach to any of the things that I do.
So two things. One is I'm curious about the role your poetry group plays in your evolution as a poet and the development of the poems. Let's go there first, and then I'll double back to my other question. Yeah, talk to me a bit about that.
Well, there are 4 of us now in the group. We aren't exactly the same 4, but some of us have been in this group since the 90s. And then there are others who have joined, and it's shifted slightly over the years. But for me, I think one of the really wonderful things about writing with the same group of people for years is that we know the areas that we're writing about. And we know if one of us goes into a place that has been too frightening or too overwhelming or whatever. And so we can really help each other have the courage to write the stuff that seemed unwritable. So I think that is a really, really wonderful thing. And we can see if one of us is making a real breakthrough linguistically or however. And we're right quite differently, really, but we're good listeners and we're kind. And kindness seems to me in writing poetry is so personal that if it's not safe to be with other people, you shouldn't be there because it's not going to help you.
Right. That's so true. I could not agree with you more. Yeah. Yeah. The second part then of this process piece, you mentioned before that you sometimes need to let the poems sit for a bit. So that's a question, how long sometimes between drafts or revisiting a poem? And secondly, do you ever bring the same poem back to the group, for example, for another look and another look?
I don't mostly bring them back, but I could. That would be fine. Some of us do bring something back. As far as if I have a new poem, I probably work it for at least a couple of days, a week, and then usually I put it away for a while. And for me, that's hugely helpful because what's the matter becomes immediately obvious. Sometimes it's not immediately obvious. And the poets can say, what's happening here? I'm confused, or oh, there's a spelling mistake, whatever. And so I can keep going back for quite a while. And yeah.
Okay. Which I guess circles back to that. How do you ever know that they're finished? And of course, maybe they
Well,
never truly are.
well, sometimes, yeah, well, I should say that often I think it's finished. And then I look again 3 weeks later, 2 months later. Oh, because it takes me a while to see. And it's also true, it seems to me, that if we're writing about personal experience, we know what we're talking about, but clearly other people don't. And so when they get lost, you need other people to say, I'm lost, what's happening? And so that's extremely helpful, because it's very hard to step outside of a poem and understand how, or feel how it's working oneself. I mean, obviously, we all do a fair amount of that, but still, there are places where we need help.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes perfect sense. So, and that sort of describes how one might work, or how you work your way around to something that you're fairly satisfied with. Now, you have published a number of collections now of poems. How does that work when you go from the single piece that you can sort of live with and seems to be working, conveying what you're thought? How do you begin to pull a collection together? How do you select that? How do you order them? Do you sit down with an idea? I want to write a collection of poems about artists, and in the case of the last one, or artwork. Or how do you pull a collection together?
Mostly I don't set out with an idea. I have been writing poems about artists for a long time, and a number of them have been published. But when I went online and saw that Frog Hollow was open for submissions, I thought, oh, I'll write a few more poems to go with the artist poems that I already had. So I did that, but that's not usually how I do it. I tend to be obsessed. And I've been obsessed with my challenging family. I've been obsessed about nature, but living in Victoria, I'm not writing about that as much as I did. I was obsessed for a long time with a collection of poems about Jonestown, because a very good friend of mine from university had gone to Jonestown and died there. And he was an extremely bright guy. And you know, the phrase "to drink the Kool-Aid" insinuates that these people were stupid, and they weren't stupid. They were also at a certain point trapped there. But I was trying to figure out what was happening for him there. And of course, I have no idea what was happening, but that's a collection that I never found a publisher for. I still think about, because I have 3 collections of poetry, and I finally gave up on that. Yeah, the most recent manuscript that hasn't found a home yet is called Family Trees, and it sort of started with traveling in the US and going to visit the bristlecone pines. And the bristlecone pines are these ancient trees at 10,000 feet in the White Mountains, but we've now discovered that they're in a number of high points in the West. And they are so expressive. They're half of the time, half their bark is gone, but enough is still there to keep them alive. They're sort of dying every day at the same point that they're still living. And so I wrote a long poem about that, and then it kind of fit together with my family poem. So, and finally, my mother died at 101, this past June. And that was pretty amazing because she had gone to stay with my brother, and nothing was killing her, but she was increasingly in discomfort of various sorts and just kind of fed up. So one day she said to him she wanted to die, and hospice came and gave him the meds, and she slipped away. And then I started actually sort of having a connection to her from the sky. So she's in there too. So, and none of that was planned. None of it was ever really planned.
So you will, it sounds almost like this the process that you describe in terms of creating the poems, creating your art, also applies then to pulling a collection together. You find the threads, you pull them together, allow the work to form itself in some way. Is that fair?
In many ways. And I think if I'm at the point of thinking I might have a collection, I print it all out. And then I just start moving them around, and I just try to feel what the order is, and like that. Yep.
Okay. So now I'm curious, you pull your collection together, you submit it. What role does an editor play in that organizing? Is that a process, or do you present it fait accompli and that's it?
Well, I think now you pretty well have to have it pretty well together, because most of the publishers don't have time to mess with things, as in the earlier days they did. There was more real possibility of working with an editor, but publishing is tough these days. Yeah. Publishing in journals is tougher than it used to be. When I first started sending to journals, nothing was taken. And then for a while, a few things would be taken. And then for a while, out of every package I sent out, probably one or two would be taken. And then it went back to nothing was taken. And yeah, it's hard. You know, after you get used to having poems accepted, it's kind of shocking when everything's just rejected. But talking to other poets, I don't think it's that unusual. I think, and besides, guess what? I'm getting old, and the young ones coming up write differently. And there is fashion in poetry, of course. So it takes figuring out what journals are kind of on your wavelength. And I've just had 2 poems just came out in the Antigonish Review, and it's been a while since anything came out, so that was very nice. I'm reading through, it just came in the mail a day or two ago, and reading through, I see, yes, a lot of the poetry has real connection to emotion, and a lot of the journals are not publishing stuff that has obvious emotion.
Interesting. So I as with anything, I guess there would be trends and patterns and fashion in poetry. It's funny to think about, but yes.
But it is true. Yeah.
So fashion aside and trends, what do you think, and this is a tough question, but what do you think makes a really great poem?
A really great poem to me is someone using language, working with language in a way that surprises me, that bring me to a place that I wouldn't have gotten to without that kind of poem. I still don't think I'm a very good reader. It goes along with being a lousy technician. So I have to be able to have an entrance to it. And I think a lot of people find entrances to poetry that I don't find entrances to. And I wish I did, but obviously wonderful language and surprising connections.
If someone was interested in practicing the art of writing poetry, do you have any suggestions? What should they do? How do you get better?
You get better, I think, by having good readers. So that may be a class, which if it's a good class can be fantastic. Good poets who, are mentors can be hugely helpful. I took a workshop with Jane Monroe a couple of years ago, and when she looked at the poem that I had brought for her to look, actually it was an early version of the Bristlecone Pines, and she asked me questions as if she were a therapist, and she pulled out so many things that hadn't even occurred to me. And then I started working on that poem for another year or longer, I don't know. I think, yeah, for me, it's an open-ended way of working, that someone is looking for what is it that's working for you? What are you doing? And someone who is very good at that can really help me make it into a poem.
Okay.
And a poetry group. I think if you have a good group who you trust, who are kind, that's an enormous help.
Right. Do you think so? I recently posted on Facebook. Tell me a line of poetry that stuck with you. And I was astonished at how many answers came back. Dozens and dozens from people I haven't heard from for ages, people who are not in the kind of writing literature circle, just the whole gamut of people. And everyone had a line or two or a whole stanza that they immediately just, shared in this thread. And I was really surprised, to be honest. Yeah. And that, it gave me hope. But I'm going to ask you this question. Is poetry do we still need it? Why do we need it? Why do we need poetry today?
Well, I think we need whatever way in people have to connect to mystery, to what we don't really know, to what's troubling. There is a whole lot of troubling things I find. I talk about politicians. I find the politicians who promise all their great work about climate change and old growth logging and promise and don't do anything. And there's a lot of very important things to think about and to write about or not write about, but to work with. There's an awful lot of really difficult things. And I think poetry can be a way to do that.
So still relevant. We haven't lost. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. When you mentioned a line, what came into my head is Yeats from Crazy Jane Talks to the Bishop, where nothing can be whole or soul that has not been rent. And I think that's my core belief, we will all be rent. And we hope we will be rent in a way that we can come back together again with more courage.
Right.
Yeah.
But
nobody comes out unscathed.
This is true. Yes, absolutely. Tell me, what are you working on now? Both on the visual art side, give me a quick idea, and then also in your poetry.
The visual art side, I just had a show at Exchanges Gallery, which is a collective gallery, and so it just came down about 10 days ago. So I'm wondering where I'm going next. I stalk around in my studio and wonder what's going to happen. And I guess I don't think I have a particular poetical subject that I'm really working on, except I'm a storyteller, which is also it's not fashionable to tell stories, but I'm always interested in stories. When I meet people, I want to know their story. I hope they want to know my story. And so I'm still kind of telling stories. But if a story comes up, then what is it about it? And if I start writing, I often don't know what it is, but if I'm lucky, I might get somewhere. And a lot of the stories that are in my poems go back many, many years, and I find that I'm only now figuring out what was happening. And maybe in another 10 years, I'll realize I only got that far and something else was happening. And you never know if you're figuring out what was going on with other people. You never know. But it seems to me, getting older, I'm more willing to look at myself. And that often helps, trying to take responsibility.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so often if there's a story, there may be a timeline, and with luck, some shift.
Fair enough. Yes, we can only hope, right, that we're
We can only hope.
evolving and moving forward in
Right.
some way, right?
Yeah.
Growing, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Do you have another poem you'd like to share with us?
Sure.
Great.
I will read you the last poem from this collection, which is about Betty Goodwin, Canadian artist. She was a painter and a printer and an installation artist. And I find her work, it's interesting because for years she worked with 30 old tarps, and somehow they had a tremendous amount of emotion in them too. So she's there with the feeling. This is called How She Abides, Betty Goodwin. Always the body, the homeless, the falling, the fallen. The body, half disappeared, smudged, obscured, almost merged with beaconed brown earth. The body, like a leaf on autumn's wind, like a carcass, like a carcass hung upside down in the butcher's cold storage, or on its side, feet bare, head skewed, a row of rounded rocks on a polished steel shelf below. The blur, the half-charted passage, dry-eyed weeping to another somewhere. The empty room, empty bed, rusting above a coursing river, islanded from its flow. The body and the empty vests which once held it, in memory of her father, a tailor, too soon gone. Hands, needles, thread, pattern pieces overlaid, vests buried. The body, the swimmers floating near the surface or plunged, who like her father smoothing woolen worsted, smooths what throbs, what can't be held, holds us. Who lives in charcoal, pastel, and graphite, turns scarred and dirty old tarps into witness, unbearable tenderness. Who like a reverse Midas stretches her hand to raw holiness. How she abides with us, in our bodies, in the grief that comes wordless, whose art is cottage, all the rough-hewn beauty, swift passing presence.
Oh, That's awful and beautiful at the same time. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
For anyone who would like to track down a copy of this collection, where can you point them? Where might they be able to find a copy?
Go online to Frog Hollow Press, and then their whole catalog is there. So you go to catalog and scroll down through all the things they have published, and eventually you get to my book, which is called How Light Edges.
Perfect. Thank you. Anything else you'd like to share before we say farewell for now?
Well, just what a pleasure it is to see you after
Likewise.
years. It's just
I know.
amazing.
It has been too long. This has been just delightful to chat with you and to hear what you're up to and to reconnect. Thank you so much for taking the time.
You asked great questions. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. This has been another conversation with a writing professional with Nikki Tate and Writers on Fire. If you'd like more information, come check us out at writersonfire.net.